Patrick Henningsen and TNT.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the program. I'm your host, Patrick Henningsen. We'll be live and direct for the next 2 hours here on TNT, Today's News Talk. Appreciate you guys coming along for the ride. We've got a very impactful program today. Got quite a few stories that we're going to get through. We're going to hit a couple of the big ones straight off the bat. We'll hit the Julian Assange story. Big breaking news there. The right to a fresh appeal. We're going to bring onto the program in a few minutes investigative journalist, independent journalist from Europe, Taylor Hudak, who's been following this case for a very long time, very closely. She's going to give us some of her commentary on this, the ramifications of it, what to expect, what next. There's some of the questions we'll be asking with regards to this story. Very important story. Of course, us that work in the media, we should be interested in this, right? Every independent journalist, this should be a priority story, because what happens to Julian Assange affects us in the independent media, and TNT was there on the ground only a few months ago to cover some of the breaking developments in that case. So TNT has represented itself very well with regards to this story and fighting for Julian Assange, fighting for free speech and the free press. This is what we're all about here. Now, in the second hour, we're going to be joined by TNT's political editor, Basil Valentine. We had another guest booked. Unfortunately, because of the time zone issue, it's quite late for them. Weren't able to secure an ICC lawyer to comment on the Israeli charges. So we'll try to rebook that person for one of the coming days. We'll still work on that. Now, we'll bring Basil Valentine on as well. We also got commentary and analysis on that story, which I'll be giving, as well as other Israeli-related stories. Why did Israel raid the Associated Press's facilities in Israel? That's the question. We'll answer that as well. And Robert Fico, Prime Minister of Slovakia, some of the ramifications of his attempted assassination. By the way, he's pulled through, as we covered yesterday with Tony Gosling on this program. He's pulled through, but there's big ramifications. This really speaks to a massive failure in the EU and NATO. Where does Eastern Europe lie in all of this? What's their future? Pretty bleak by this attempted assassination of Robert Fico, a populist, ostensibly on the left, not a right-wing populist, a democratic socialist by anyone's measure, but it's being painted in the media as a right-wing populist, which is patently ridiculous. But then again, this is the political and media environment that we exist in, so we have to correct these things now and again. So we'll get back to that story. And of course, in the second hour, we're going to do a full breakdown on the U.S. sanctions, not just against Russia. Guess what? They're threatening Germany as well. This is one of the great harbingers of late-stage empire, when the hegemon starts threatening their allies as well as their perceived enemies. We'll talk about that. Why is Germany being put in the crosshairs of the U.S. Treasury Department and OFAC and Janet Yellen? We'll talk about that in the second hour. We'll definitely be covering that story. Might even break to that story in the first hour. We're watching it right now. Our team is looking at that story, giving us new developments on that. Now, right now, let's go back to the Julian Assange story. I want to welcome onto the stage independent journalist who is based in Central Europe at the moment, and her name is Taylor Hudak. She's been following this story very closely for a long time, and we've got her on the line right now. Taylor, how are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you for having me.
No, it's our pleasure. It's great to have you on the program. And it's great to be able to report something positive in this important story, Taylor, with Julian Assange. This has been a long, tedious, painful, dare I say, torturous process since April 2019, when he was extraordinarily rendered from the Ecuadorian embassy in London into Belmarsh Prison, Southeast London. Latest development, Taylor, walk us through what's happened.
Yes, so I'm very happy to share with the listeners, the viewers right now, that there is good news to report on the continued prosecution of Julian Assange. Yesterday, on May 20th, a 2-hour permission to appeal hearing took place, and the 2 high court judges returned with their judgment, and they are going to allow Julian Assange to appeal and thus continue to fight extradition to the United States. Now, the appeal itself is going to be very interesting, and I'll explain why here in a moment. But specifically, he is permitted to appeal on two grounds rather, and that is related to the fact that extradition to the United States would be incompatible with Article 10 of the European Convention on Human Rights, or ECHR, that is a right to freedom of expression, which also includes a right to share and publish information. And then the other ground was extradition would be barred under Section 81B of the 2003 UK Extradition Act, which prevents extradition to the United States, or to particular countries rather, if that individual would be at risk of prejudice at their trial due to a number of factors, one of them being nationality. And that is the point of interest here in this case, because again, for those, just to remind you all that Julian Assange is not an American citizen, he is an Australian citizen, and there is great concern that he could be prejudiced against because of his nationality. And I'll explain here why these 2 points tie in. It's a little bit technical at this stage, but essentially, the idea here is that because Mr. Assange is not a U.S. citizen, he would not be afforded First Amendment protections. And at this point, the court is viewing Article 10 of the ECHR and the First Amendment to be equivalents. Of course, they're not exactly, but that is how the court perceives it. So the judges now believe that he could be at risk of not having this freedom of expression, which is guaranteed in Article 10 of the ECHR. And that is because, of course, he's an Australian citizen, which is then putting him at risk of being discriminated or prejudiced at trial due to his nationality. So that's how these 2 points are interconnected. And it's very interesting, Patrick, I have to say, because previously the courts, the judges have not really taken an interest in this point. The initial judge, the lower court judge who heard this case, ruled on January 4th of 2021 against extradition, but it wasn't on the press freedom points. It was actually on Assange's mental health. She felt that it would be oppressive to extradite him to the United States and in violation of Section 91 of the UK Extradition Act. But she actually ruled in favor of the US government on the broader press freedom arguments in this case. But these 2 high court judges are concerned now that this is going to be a violation of the First Amendment, and more importantly, really a violation of Article 10. That is the domestic legislation that matters in the UK. So it's a very interesting development in this case, but what it means is that Assange, yes, has the opportunity to appeal once again before the courts, prevent his extradition, but again, extradition still remains a possibility, but this was the, I think, one of the best outcomes that we could have had yesterday.
I really like the fact that this issue has come up and is front and center, because that's the inherent contradiction in all of this, that the U.S. government can reach across the world effectively and, extradite somebody who's not even a U.S. citizen, who hasn't committed any crime per se on U.S. soil, who in this case is a journalist, a publisher, and working with an organization or for an organization he founded, WikiLeaks, that is effectively a press outlet. So the problem was, Taylor, before that, even though they would extradite him to the U.S., he would somehow not be afforded U.S. rights on U.S. soil within the U.S. legal system, effectively like a Guantanamo Bay type situation. The way they treat terrorist suspects at Gitmo, that's the sort of category he'd be put in. And this is kind of now recognizing that, no, these are rights, and it's kind of really exposing the contradiction in this U.S. move, which is quite an audacious move by the U.S. It's just that now there's been some legal pushback. I think this is very positive, Taylor, because it puts those in key issues: First Amendment, freedom of speech, freedom of the press. It puts them right squarely in the frame, and I think this is really fundamental to this story, this case.
Absolutely, I agree. And I also want to make note that the appeal will apply to all 18 counts. So not just 3, which is what actually the prosecution was suggesting if the judges wanted to allow for an appeal, they suggested that it should only be allowed for 3 counts. The judges dismissed that, and they are allowing an appeal on all 18 counts. So that's also very significant. This is a turning point in this case, and many who have also been following the case have been following the trial for quite some time, including those with Reporters Without Borders, Assange's family, his attorneys, Barry Pollock. Everybody is looking at this decision from the High Court yesterday and stating that this is a victory. So it's something to welcome, to celebrate. And again, it goes to the heart of this case. And so many of the other decisions related to this case have been quite negative for the past few years. So again, first positive development, I'd say, in the past 3 years, really. And I think that there's a lot of hope. And I think that it also signals to the United States that it's time to revisit this continued prosecution and perhaps put an end to it, because I mean it when I say that this is really embarrassing for the United States government to continue with this prosecution, yet all the while pointing out the flaws in other countries and pointing out other countries for their potential human rights abuses or press freedom violations. The United States and its officials cannot continue to do this while they are prosecuting a journalist for publishing truthful, factual information that was in the public interest. And it's also important to note that it is only Julian Assange who's being prosecuted. There were other collaborators on this work, the New York Times, The Guardian, Washington Post, who also worked with Assange, worked with Wikileaks, published this information, but only Julian Assange is being prosecuted. So it's a political persecution, but it's also a selective prosecution. This point, I do not think will come up during the appeal, but I just want to make note of that as well, that this seems to be a targeted effort here.
Yeah, I want to talk about the political persecution of the prosecution. That was an issue that was brought up by Assange's defense team. I want to talk about that in a moment. In the meantime, I'm going to play this clip here. This is Julian's wife, Stella Assange, speaking recently to LBC and reiterating some of these points. But we'll go ahead and roll this, and we'll further comment. But yeah, go ahead and roll this. Stella.
What the decision today turned on was the fact that the United States did not give satisfactory assurance in relation to Julian being able to rely on constitutional protections for freedom of speech.
And that's basically because the politicians and the judges are separate parts of the system, so the politicians can't really order the courts to do this or that.
Yes, the United States said, well, we can't really issue an assurance on this because it will be up to the judge. But they also, what they didn't do was say, well, we're not going to argue that. So all they did was say, you're welcome to make the argument in court and we'll see what happens. And of course, the judges didn't like this line of reasoning. And so they sided with Julian in this case.
So I get the sense, Taylor, is the first time on the UK side that we've seen what looks like an independent judiciary on this, because it has been extremely politicized. I mean, you've been in the courts as well. I've saw the Woolwich Crown Court, that the hearing that was interrupted by COVID in early 2020. And his defense team just demolished the prosecution. I mean, it wasn't even close. It was embarrassing, actually. But the judge wasn't fazed by any of it. And it was just full steam ahead with the agenda. It really seemed like the British government and the U.S. Deep state, if you will, had already made their predetermined decision on this now. So why do you think that the length of time that the fighting, the various appeals, the longer this drags on, it becomes somewhat of a political liability, especially in a U.S. election year? I mean, even noises from the Biden White House about looking at the Assange case. Is there some political advantage maybe in possibly resolving this? I realize this is a real battleground here when you're talking about politics, the Washington, the intelligence community, the Mike Pompeos of the world, and now you have this decision in Britain. How do you think this is being read in Washington?
Yeah, so I think that those in Washington right now, after hearing of this decision yesterday, should really be revisiting the continued prosecution of this case, as I said. But I think that it would look very bad on the Biden administration to have Julian Assange extradited to the United States right before an election. And I think that perhaps, again, this is just a speculation or my guesses here, that they would want to drag that out after the election, because I don't think it would look good for the Biden administration. And of course, the Biden administration has every opportunity to separate itself from this case, to drop the charges. And there has been some discussion about that I've seen in the media, and nothing really has come of that at this point. But there was a lot of pressure also put on the Trump administration to drop this case, and they chose not to, and to also pardon Assange, and Trump chose not to do so. But it is true that during yesterday's hearing, the subject of the hearing was really the arguments presented by both sides that were in relation to two U.S. assurances, two diplomatic assurances that were issued before the court. Because again, this was actually the second permission to appeal hearing that was held. There was already a permission to appeal hearing held February 20th and 21st. The judges chose to stay their decision and have another hearing. And so this was that next hearing, yesterday's hearing. And so at that point, the judges allowed for the U.S. government to issue two assurances on points of appeal that they thought Assange could potentially win in court. And what these high court judges decided yesterday was that on the first assurance, that the United States didn't meet the requirement of certainty there. So this was again related to Assange not being prejudiced by reason of his nationality, and that he would have First Amendment protections. They did not buy the U.S. government's assurance on this point, and it's a deviation from what we've seen in the past, where diplomatic assurances were put before the court and the high court judges took them at face value and accepted them. So that was always a risk in this case when it came to yesterday's hearing, but it was good to see these two judges analyze this a little bit further and issue, I think, a very fair judgment on this case. And also, too, if I'm not mistaken, I do believe that both of these high court judges are at the most senior level position possible. So they are not as easily, let's say, manipulated or controlled by receiving a promotion or something like that, which I believe has happened previously with this case and the various parties involved or various judges involved. So that's another thing to take into consideration.
Yeah, and I'm also quite surprised the invocation of the European Convention on Human Rights. I mean, post-Brexit, this has become a real sort of point of contention with the sort of hardline Brexiteers in the UK. So to have that sort of overriding legal sort of, benchmark there in terms of rights and so forth, that's interesting, very interesting. That's a big development. But, there's this case, we spoke to Trevor Fitzgibbons a few weeks ago about the case in the Southern District of New York in federal courts about the people who had been spied upon while visiting the embassy. That's a legal battle that's in motion right now. And that's really, I think, pivotal, because that speaks to the politicization of the U.S. government's role in this, and the bilateral treaty between Britain and the U.S. Absolutely precludes any extradition on any sort of political basis or someone who's being politically targeted. And in that sense, the CIA, Mike Pompeo's comments, all of these things together show that this might be in violation of the extradition treaty between the U.S. In other words, there's no ground for extradition. The U.S. has blown it, basically, already. Now, the judges have overlooked that previously. Wasn't a major point, but his defense has made that point many times. That could get revisited as well based on the result of some of these legal challenges. So they are very important, what's going on in the U.S. courts. I don't know if you've had an opportunity to look at that case at all.
Yes, I have been able to look at it a little bit here. I did actually speak with the lead attorney on that case, Richard Roth. It's a extraordinary case. Just to provide some background information quickly here for the listeners and viewers, when Julian Assange was having visitors, goes to see him in the embassy, the CIA was spying on these visitors, was spying on Julian Assange himself, was also spying on his attorneys, the privileged communications that he was having with his attorneys. And of course, that all of that information is going to those behind the prosecution, right? So there were 4 Americans who have filed a civil lawsuit for violation of their Fourth Amendment rights and against unlawful search and seizure. And so there's an ongoing case in the United States, which it will be interesting to see if that could have an impact on any trial. I don't know if it will have any bearing on the extradition case in the UK. But yes, this point about the political nature of this case, I mean, extradition itself, I mean, it's inherently political. However, on this point, the judges, high court judges have decided not to hear an appeal on these points. But I think it's a very important thing to discuss here, because essentially what is happening is that Assange, a journalist, publisher, could be extradited to a country whose intelligence agency conspired to kidnap and assassinate him. Obviously, he is not going to receive a fair trial under those conditions. It seems almost reckless that the UK would continue to go through with this case or hear this case and not put an end to it, or that these judges rather would not be able to see that as a serious risk to his safety and right to a fair trial. But there were efforts to allow for additional evidence to be submitted to the court related to this CIA and kidnapping plot. And the judges have not allowed for that additional evidence to be admitted, unfortunately.
That's the problem with the national security state. A lot of this stuff falls under the closed national security letter seal, unfortunately. But it is interesting how things are developing. I personally hope, anyway, I don't think anything at this point. This has just dragged on for so many years. But I personally hope that this will become a political liability for both people in the British government and their establishment, as well as the U.S., and really will speak ultimately to their credibility and the democratic values that they espouse so often and loudly under the rules-based international order. That the longer this drags on, the more opportunities there are to poke holes in it, to undercut it, to weaken it, and hopefully at some point. I mean, the other part of this, Taylor, that I have a hard time understanding is he's been in a Category A prison alongside murderers, serial killers, violent criminals, and terrorists in Belmarsh prison. He's unconvicted of any crime, yet he's still in a Category A prison under an extradition order or threat of an extradition order from the U.S. Why can he not be released to his home with an ankle bracelet? I mean, has anybody made this argument yet? I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
Yes, it's a really good point. And as far as I understand, it was Niels Melzer, who was the former UN Special Rapporteur on Torture. He actually said that it's quite unusual that you would have someone who is facing extradition to be incarcerated for such a long time. Usually they are at home with an ankle bracelet on a form of house arrest. So this is already like quite unusual and not typical procedure that he is imprisoned. There has been there was rather an effort to release him, and this was shortly after the initial extradition decision was issued in January of 2021, and the judge ruled against it because she felt that he was a flight risk. So that's the last time I think legally the issue of bail has been addressed, but it is very disproportionate, in my view, that someone who is facing charges in the United States, not even in the UK, is being held without charge in the UK for non-violent offenses, is being held in one of the worst, if not the worst, prison in the UK, which is Belmarsh prison. So again, it goes back to another point that there's really nothing normal about this case. There's been so many legal irregularities, so many aspects to this case have been atypical with regard to procedure, and there have been numerous opportunities, I think, to drop the case. One of them, of course, being the fact that, as I mentioned earlier, his privileged communications with his lawyers was spied upon. That should have been sufficient to throw the case out of court. It was sufficient to throw Daniel Ellsberg's case out of court because his communications with his psychiatrist were spied upon by the United States government or intelligence agencies. And in his case, had to be dropped. And so it's very similar to the situation with Julian Assange here, given that his communications with his lawyers was spied upon, but instead this case continues. But we are all hopeful now, of course, that these two high court judges, and I don't know if they're going to be hearing or overseeing the case rather on this next phase, this next appeal, but I hope that whomever is overseeing this case on appeal will not be swayed by any political matter and will do the right thing and put an end to this. And better yet, of course, we would hope that the United States would drop this case.
And then just lastly, Taylor, I appreciate you joining us as well. I realize it's a little bit of a late hour there in Central Europe, so we really appreciate that. What about the time frame on this? What do you have any idea, or does anybody have any idea of like how long this phase could go on? Are we talking about months or a couple of years? This fresh appeals process. What do you know? What have you heard?
So this Friday, I believe, May 24th. Yes, so May 24th, both parties, both the defense and the prosecution, will have to submit some sort of joint document or joint order that is related to this upcoming appeal. And I believe that this document is really going to provide their dates of availability for this next appeal hearing to take place. And I am not sure what the time frame is on that, if there is sort of like a time limit in which they have to have this appeal hearing. But I know that the next phase is actually, or next important date is just in a couple of days here when they issue this document. I don't know if that's going to be made available to the public, but we are also still waiting on the official written judgment to be issued. That is the judgment that was delivered yesterday in court. So we're still waiting for the written judgment. May take a few days or a week or two, but that is what we're looking at for the future of this case. And unfortunately, it's important for people to remember Assange, as I understand, his family is stating that he's not well. He's quite ill. He was actually so ill that he was not able to attend the hearing yesterday. And throughout this whole time, he remains in Belmarsh prison, now on the 5th year in prison. So just important to remember this as well.
Yeah, let's just hope. I think hopefully people are going to put some public pressure on the system to release him on sort of house arrest or some sort of situation like that. That would be a great development if that was to happen. That's certainly something that would at least make this a civilized proceedings, because up to this point, you're really putting his, as you say, Taylor, his health at risk, mental health, physical health. That's just unacceptable. It should be unacceptable for anybody, even if you believe that he is guilty. It goes against all the sort of Western norms and values in terms of rights and due process and everything else. But Taylor, give us a shout out where people can follow you and your work right now.
Yes, so you can find my reporting on this case at Activism Munich on YouTube. It's available in English and German. I also publish for The Last American Vagabond. That is thelastamericanvagabond.com. I'm also active on Twitter and on Telegram at Taylor Hudak Media.
Okay, yeah, follow Taylor, especially on this case. She's been keeping a close eye on this, always up to date with the latest details. Taylor Hudak, thank you very much for joining us this week on TNT, Today's News Talk.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Our pleasure. There she goes, ladies and gentlemen. Follow Taylor and her work, a great up-and-coming independent journalist. And this is a really important case, as we said, for all the reasons that we outlined before this segment. It affects all of us, affects all of you listening and watching TNT, Today's News Talk. Let's take a break right now with the network. And when we come back, we're going to hit some of the biggest stories internationally, connecting right back, as usual, to Washington. We'll explain how and why on the other side. I'm Patrick Henningsen. Stay there, folks.
TNT's